back off a little from the current controversy and just think a little bit about what really the relationship between the central bank and the government is. Ultimately, a good analogy, I think Dr. Viralacharya talked about T20 and test match, but I think a good analogy of what the central bank is it's a seatbelt for the government, which is the driver. The driver can decide whether to put on the seatbelt or not, and if the driver doesn't put on the seatbelt, which is useful, the seatbelt is useful in times of a crash. Now think of the central bank as thinking about that crash and saying, I want to protect financial stability because I don't want that to be a terrible event. And of course, the driver is thinking about the process of normal driving and says, well, I want to be relatively free of constraint. But when they talk to each other, they realize there is some value to putting on that seatbelt because it prevents the really unfortunate eventuality. And, if we want to extend the analogy further, one can think of Dr. Acharya's speech as basically being that warning which comes on when you don't put on your seatbelt, saying, put on your seatbelt, and hopefully eventually that warning is adhered to. Now, the historic relationship between the government and the RBI has been based on the fact that the government naturally and correctly thinks about pushing growth, and for that it wants maximum freedom given to all the entities who are responsible for growth. While the RBI focuses on financial stability and says, here is the amount of growth I can allow without impinging on financial stability. And they work with each other on that basis. The government always pushes the innumerable letters on my table coming from the government saying, relax this, relax that, relax something else. And they knew that we would look at the letter carefully, take a view, but that view would be saying, how can we maximize growth while protecting financial stability? And then when we said no, they would go away and say, okay, fine, they've thought about it. And 2 days later, another letter would come on some other issue, and they would keep trying to press the boundary. Ultimately, the responsibility was for the RBI about financial stability, and if we failed on it, we would be held to task. So given that responsibility, we had the authority to say no. And let me remind you of that quote in Dr. Subbarao's book, where he talked about the relationship between Dr. Reddy and Mr. Chidambaram based on a phone call, where Dr. Reddy's side he was hearing, and Dr. Reddy said no, 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 and yes, eventually. And when Dr. Subbarao asked, what were you saying no to? He said, he asked me to relax this and relax that, and I kept saying no. Ultimately, he asked, can you hear me? And I said, yes, and that's how the call ended. But that, I think, anecdote is really about the relationship between the Reserve Bank and the government. The government appoints the governor, appoints the deputies, but ultimately goes by the views, knowing these are professionals. They're not doing it for political reasons or for their own self-interest. They're doing it because they've taken a view on the ultimate stability of the country.